And we're on. Okay, so hello and welcome everyone. Also say hello to my cat who is currently joining us for some reason. His name's King Richard the First. Um, so um, are there any questions before we get running into the lecture? Um, are there any questions about the format or anything along those lines? Anybody who couldn't ask about that in the previous session?
I have a question about the 100 word thing. So, do we do it for each reading 100 words, or do we do like a summary, not a summary, but our opinion of like all of the readings for each week in one 100 word description?
The 100 words is for all of the readings of that week. So
Okay.
you only need to do 100 words for all of the readings. If you want to focus on one particular reading, that's fine. If you want to, talk about how all the readings kind of come together. For instance, this week the readings are you have the three amendments and the black codes, and they're actually kind of reacting to each other. So sometimes you can um, interpret it that way. It's all up to you. I just want to see that you're actually engaging with the materials.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, all right. So today we are talking about. Hold on. Um, hopefully it does it right. Um, full screen. There we go. um, we are talking about Reconstruction. Now, wait, why isn't it showing my presenter view? There we go. So Reconstruction is kind of the starting point of this class, and um, the reason why we divide uh, the American history between 1877 and present is because Reconstruction ended in 1877. So this will kind of form the basis for a lot of things to come. So um, Reconstruction is generally talking about how the U.S. reformulated itself after the Civil War. Though technically it did begin during the Civil War. Reconstruction is generally considered to be between 1863 and 1877. So it technically started during the war, and we'll get to why there's funkiness with the whole meaning of that. But keep in mind, this is kind of defining what the Civil War was ultimately going to do to the country. Um, and as Eric Foner called it, he called it the unfinished revolution. Now that um, might be a bit confusing because normally you don't think of the Civil War as a revolution, but that's why he calls it unfinished. This was a chance to remake America and really do a radical change from having slavery to not. Um, and that change did not come. It took a century before real um, progress was made um, in terms of race relations. Of course, the fact that slavery ceased to exist during the Civil War um, is pretty important. So the meaning of the of Reconstruction is actually quite a persistent question. Um, is it purely about rehabilitating the country after a prolonged civil war, um, or is it about recovering? Simply reconstructing what was destroyed. Is it about punishing the South for having seceded? Um, this is that point right there is actually, while normally a bit of a myth, there is some. There were many congressmen who actually wanted it to be punishment, though that punishment never came. Then there's a larger question as to, does Reconstruction only count towards the South, the people who had seceded during the Civil War? Um, or is it referring to the whole of the country, what Elliot West, a historian of the American West, calls greater Reconstruction? Because some Reconstruction stuff really does apply to the West, um, and we'll get into some of that. So it's this also a question as to um, what counts as being reconstructed. Um, for instance, California actually had a pretty large secession movement in 1861, um, and they just barely held on and stayed in the Union. So, what do you do with states that came pretty close to secession, and then territories such as here in New Mexico, which actually had slavery? Um, so dealing with that kind of stuff um, is a question as to whether or not it's actually part of Reconstruction. Then you also have a question as to whether or not it was about civil rights or states' rights. Now, you'll hear a lot of people on the internet referring to states' rights for very different reasons, but here we're talking about when a state had the right to rejoin the Union. Um, you know, they had obviously a good chunk of them had rebelled during the Civil War, and so there was a question about whether or not what to do with these rebellious states. Should they become just territories? Should they be reduced into some sort of lesser status than that? Or should they eventually be allowed to come back into the Union in more peaceable manners? Um, so you have those questions, but there's also um, the idea of what to do with all these freed slaves. Um, there's obviously quite a bit of backlash to that, especially in the southern states. But even in the North, there's a larger question about what free labor means. Um, the Republicans had come to power specifically on what was called a free soil platform, meaning that they wanted free labor as in the right to people who were laborers and not slaves, um, and were being paid for their work. That, um, but that was becoming a hot button issue in the North as well, as more and more people started working for a wage. And so the labor movement arose during this, and see how all of this can open the question as to whether or not Reconstruction is about the South. Um, and then there's also whether if it was about civil rights, as in the right to not be a slave, not be owned as a since you are a person, um, to um, be treated equally by the government, and to vote for representation in that government. Um, those are the three fundamental civil rights that will be contested throughout all of this. Um, the This didn't really get resolved during Reconstruction, so it's an unfinished revolution. Generally, historians will say that the Reconstruction was about civil rights, especially after 1868. Um, but you will also get a lot of people from the South who believe in what's called the lost cause myth, which essentially says that recon- uh, that Reconstruction was trying to punish the South for having rebelled and to reduce the South into a form of servitude. Now, this is a myth, but there is that granule of truth that some Northern congressmen really did want that. It just didn't happen. Um, and they a lot of Southerners have a particularly aggrieved attitude about this even today. And finally, the something that I have to take note on, um, that throughout the beginning of this class, when we're talking about Republicans and Democrats, they are essentially the opposite positions that they reside in today. Republicans today are the conservative party, um, whereas Republicans in the 1860s and 70s were not just liberal, but radical. In fact, in 1872, there was a split from the Republican Party because some Republicans thought that the Republican Party had become too radical, and um, they formed the Liberal Republican Party. So literally quite the opposite of what they are today. Um, Democrats were the party of the South, and we will see that the KKK, for instance, was basically a paramilitary arm of the Democrats. But by the 1950s and 60s, there was a significant change afoot, especially as Democrats came to support civil rights. Um, but that's far in the future from what we're talking about today. So just keep that in mind when I'm talking about Republicans and Democrats. They are essentially holding the opposite positions they hold today. Um, so the Reconstruction really began um, when Union troops were able to take over significant chunks of the former Confederacy. For instance, Tennessee was basically conquered by 1863. So was New Orleans. I mean, not Louisiana. Um, so Lincoln had to come up with policies in order to govern these secessionist territories. Um, so this is where Reconstruction begins, is in 1863, when he starts having when Lincoln starts proposing particular um, Reconstruction policies. And so both him and his successor, Andrew Johnson, that this period is known as presidential Reconstruction because it's directed by the president. Um, and in 1865, Lincoln very clearly stated what he wanted in this. Um, he wanted as a um, for what Reconstruction would be. In his second inaugural address, he said, "Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsmen, 200, remember bondsmen, he's kind of referring to slaves, 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago. So still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Now that sounds pretty harsh in terms of a policy that basically for every drop of blood drawn by the lash should be a drop of blood drawn by the sword. But remember, this is 1865 at the culmination of the bloodiest war in American history. It probably isn't an exaggeration. But he's also saying that the war itself should be enough to make up for that bloodshed. Um, and so Lincoln was actually quite forgiving in this policy. Of course, first thing that he had to do was appoint military governors. And essentially, these military governors had complete control over their territories, just absolute control. Essentially, installing martial law upon the states that were reconquered. Um, but he also created a system in which states could come back into the fold, to come back into the Union. And this was called the Ironclad Oath, that 10% of a state's male population had to take this oath, which was very uh simplistic. Like, just to read the first line of it: I do solemnly swear or affirm that I have never voluntarily borne arms against the United States since I have been a citizen thereof, that I have voluntarily given no aid, countenance, counsel, or encouragement to persons engaged in armed hostility thereto, and so on and so forth. um Essentially saying, like, I do not acknowledge the rebellion. Um, and like, it's a very simple oath to take, right? And to get to 10% of the male population, that doesn't seem like that difficult of a thing. But right at the beginning of 1865, what made the Ironclad Oath really difficult for a lot of Southerners to take was the passage of the 13th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment was passed in early 1865, but the ratification took until basically the end of the year. So the 13th Amendment wasn't actually the 13th Amendment ended slavery throughout the entire Union. But before that, there were the confiscation acts that were created in 1861 and 62 that gave legal impetus to confiscating slaves from rebellious Southerners. This led to the Emancipation Proclamation that was enacted on January 1st, 1863, and basically said, all right, well, you rebelled, no slaves for you. But there were still border states that had slavery. There was, of course, territories that had it here. New Mexico and Utah had slavery. And so it took the passage of the 13th Amendment to get rid of that. But this kind of put an onus against a lot of Southerners to take that oath, because they had basically rebelled to maintain their institution of slavery. They literally called their institution our peculiar institution, because they thought that it was kind of the Southern way of life, was to, keep Black people enslaved. So Lincoln never actually got any state to perform 10% of the Ironclad Oath. But the one last thing that he managed to get finished before he was assassinated in 1865 was the passage of the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau was passed in March of 1865, basically originally called the Bureau of Refugees. And essentially it was to give aid to freed slaves, to help them establish themselves, to get some education, to basically, and sometimes even to guarantee land. Because famously, General Sherman, as he was marching through Georgia, promised many slaves who accompanied him 40 acres and a mule. Um, Yet that was rescinded by the Lincoln administration. Um, so um, there were, we'll get into some of the attempts to guarantee that beyond the Freedmen's Bureau, but the Freedmen's Bureau remained kind of the key way that any kind of federal aid was administered to all of these freed slaves. Um, but of course, the problem with that, with giving specific aid to freedmen, and this is going to further alienate Southerners who had um, rebelled specifically to keep slaves. Um, so this was um, keeping the ironclad oath from being administered. A lot of people really, at this point, really believed in the power of oath keeping. That if you swear an oath that you should be a man of your word and all that kind of stuff, and you are honor bound to keep it. So they're not. So a lot of people were too, especially in the South, were too honor bound to take that oath. Although at one point there was an attempt to make it that it'd take 51% of all males in the South to do that, because there was a concern that with all of these freed slaves, that these states could basically use the freed slaves to take the oath. Um, and basically force former slaves to acquiesce to um, their own domination. But that did not come to pass before Lincoln was assassinated. Um, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, was actually, contrary to popular belief, was actually harsher about Reconstruction than Lincoln. Lincoln wanted it to be very, that ironclad oath is pretty reconciliatory. It's not that harsh of a measure. So Johnson had much harsher measures. So um, the so remember that if a state is not in the Union, for instance, we have territories such as Guam and Puerto Rico today, which cannot vote for president because they're territorial status. And so coming back into the Union is what will allow states to vote for president, and to send representatives to Congress and whatnot. So it's kind of in the president's best interest to be more reconciliatory so that they can get reelected. Especially with those states that they bring back in. And Johnson would end up bringing in two states, Tennessee and New Mexico. Hold on a second. I have a call coming in. Somebody is trying to get a hold of me. It's annoying. Anyways, the his first kind of making Reconstruction harsher was to make sure that pardons were more difficult to achieve. Lincoln was basically blanket pardoning anyone charged of crimes. That's there. In fact, of the war crimes that were prosecuted by the U.S., only one of them ended up being executed. The person who was leading a very harsh prison camp in uh, Andersonville. That person was the only one executed for any kind of sedition or you know, treason or whatever, um, for the entire Civil War. So, you know, Lincoln had the power to pardon people, and he was just blanket pardoning folks. And Johnson um, would not pardon anyone if they had not taken the oath. So you had to take an oath to get a pardon. Um, and he also simplified the oath, made it but also made it so that it denounced not only the act of rebellion, but that the rebellion was legitimate in any way whatsoever. He was very critical of making states or states that had seceded um, become uh, deny to renounce the Confederacy altogether. And part of this was for their local legislatures to actually pass legislation denouncing secession and also renouncing the debt from the war, so that no one could collect the debt from the secession. Um, and for a final bit of that the final thing that these legislatures had to pledge by act, that they had to actually vote for it, was to pledge that black people would be given the same political rights as white people. Um, Now, there's a lot of debate amongst historians as to what that even means, because a pledge is just a pledge. It's not something that you have to keep. Um, so Johnson had no means of enforcing this. Also, Johnson, as we will see in a little bit, was not is not exactly a president known for fighting for racial equality. Um, so while that seems kind of progressive, you could argue that it was just for show. But despite that, the South um, responded, and mind you, this is pretty paltry stuff, that you have to take a pledge to get a pardon. You have to have 10% of the state take that pledge in order men in the state to take that pledge in order to come back in the Union, and that you have to denounce the secession, like and pledge political rights to black people. Like that's not really that much. It's basically a bunch of pledges and oaths. It doesn't really do anything. But the South, um, which is characteristic to why they seceded in the first place, responded like this was a harsh imposition. So the first thing that they passed, and you guys will be reading the first one of these, which is the Mississippi Black Codes, um, which basically um, made laws that would kind of create virtual slavery anyways. It made it so that black people had to not be vagrants, and vagrancy can be interpreted in any number of ways, especially in the South at this point. Vagrancy could simply be that you're in public, period. um, and the black codes would imprison people for vagrancy, and then use use prison labor to sell out to plantations, and basically turn black people into slaves virtually, that they had no right to be free. um, they couldn't choose to not work, and they would be punished for not doing so. um, the combination of convict leasing and vagrancy laws really stood out. Plus, they also had um, what were called grandfather laws, basically saying that if your grandfather was not a citizen, then um, you cannot be either. Problem with that being that, of course, no slave's grandfather was a citizen. Um, so they use these kind of weasel words to try to basically reinvent slavery. Um, on top of that, um, the since in 1865, Johnson had appointed provisional governors to, although they were still military governors, but they were considered provisional. Um, the the South tried to send congressmen to Congress, but they sent a bunch of ex-Confederates, a bunch of ex-Confederate leaders. Um, and so on the 5th of December, 1865, Congress itself had to bar these congressmen from rejoining Congress. Congress actually has the power to say that to seat and unseat its own um, members, but that's quite a big thing when you have to do that to basically an entire delegation. And then on top of that, throughout 1866, there were two major what were called race riots, but are actually better termed massacres. Um, the the in May of 1866, there was the Memphis riot, which killed 48 people, and 46 of which were black. So you can tell what these race riots were targeting. And this was ignited by a shootout between black vets and black veterans, coming back from the Civil War, having fought for the Union, and police who were trying to disarm them. You know, they were marching back with their rifles. Where else are they going to put them? And so the police tried to disarm them. Somebody took a shot, and then the local white population armed up and started slaughtering black people. Only two of those police were killed in the initial shootout, and then no other white people were killed during the rest of the massacre. And if that wasn't bad enough, then there was a riot in New Orleans in July of 1866. This killed the same amount of people, but this time it was people trying to create who were campaigning to create a new constitution for New Orleans. I mean, not for Louisiana. This was a Louisiana Constitutional Convention, and they were trying to stop the Constitution from taking place by massacring the people going to this to what's called a Constituent Assembly. And part of the reason why they didn't want to acknowledge the existence of this Constituent Assembly was because it was made up of a significant amount of black people. So that killed 48 people again, 44 of which were black. So this was quite the blot on presidential Reconstruction. This kind of just like willy-nilly take an oath, make a pledge, denounce this, that, and the other thing. Was clearly not enough when you have black codes being enacted, ex-Confederates being sent to Congress, and these race massacres happening. And so Congress decided to take matters into their own hands. So an oddity about Andrew Johnson is that while he was working for a Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, Johnson himself was a Democrat. They were actually elected the second election of Lincoln. They were elected as the Union Party rather than the Republican Party because Johnson was not a Republican. Johnson would attempt to recreate the Union Party in 1868, but to no avail. And from with all of that happening in the South, Congress realized they needed to take matters into their own hands, away from this clear Democrat who is ruining the ability of Black people to live. So Congress started passing stuff, and Johnson started vetoing stuff. So their first attempt to really usurp Johnson's power was to re-up the Freedmen Bureau's funding. But the thing is, the Freedmen's Bureau actually had enough funding to go all the way until 1872. So this was more of a show of force from Congress. And Johnson vetoed it, and Congress did not override the veto. They tried, they didn't get enough votes to override it. Realized there wasn't actually a need to re-up the funding of the Freedmen's Bureau at that point, though it would set the precedent for never re-upping the Freedmen's Bureau funding. So it ran out of funding in 1872. But this is 1866. Next, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. But Johnson once again vetoed it. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is essentially the same thing as what you guys probably know as the Civil Rights Act in general, which came in 1964 and was actually signed into law by another Democrat named Johnson. Funny enough, but this Democrat named Johnson refused to do that because he thought that Southern states pledging equality was enough. He was wrong, but that was his idea. Now the the Civil Rights Act basically was the legislation predating the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment basically adopted the words of the Civil Rights Act because I think Zoom just quit on me for some reason. It says it's still recording. That's strange. Can you guys tell me where it left me off?
The 1866 Civil Rights Act.
Okay. All right. That's where I thought, I guess it just sent me a message. It like dropped for a second and then sent me a message saying like it dropped. So I don't know what happened there. Going back to screen sharing this. No, that's not the thing. There we go. This should be pinned. All right. Whoop. So, the Civil Rights Act was kind of the turning point in terms of Congress's relationship with the Johnson administration. While he vetoed it, the Civil Rights Act was passed over his veto on April 9th of 1866. And so then they they kind of drew a line in the sand with this by passing the Tenure of Office Act. And essentially what that said was that that Congress had to approve any firing of cabinet members, because a lot of Johnson's cabinet was still from the Lincoln administration. He's only been in office for a year now. And so he wanted to get rid of especially the Secretary of War, since the Secretary of War had presided over the Civil War. Johnson wanted a more reconciliatory person in office. For instance, he offered it to General Grant. He tried to offer it to a number of generals rather than civilian authority. And the Congress wanted to stop that. Now, it's actually a constitutional question. It's not really a constitutional question. We know full well that if this were to go up to the Supreme Court, it would be declared unconstitutional. But it didn't matter. Johnson wasn't arguing with it on constitutional terms. He was arguing with it purely because it was a usurpation of his power. And so he repeatedly tried to fire the Secretary of War. And throughout this, and he also vetoed it, of course. He vetoed it in March of 1867. But it was immediately passed over his veto, making it law. So he tried to what's called a pocket veto, as in there's a certain amount of time that a president has to take in order to sign something into law. And so he tried to push it off for a while, because it had actually been passed in February, and it took of 1867. So he was trying to push it off for a couple of months. Didn't work though. But before that showdown could happen, before he could really start screwing with the Secretary of War, there had also been the passage of the 14th Amendment, and this is basically the Civil Rights Amendment. It has it very clearly states that that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the states wherein they reside. So essentially, giving full citizenship to everyone who is a naturalized or native citizen. Native meaning that you were born there. So native and naturalized rights were extended to everyone, regardless of previous condition of servitude. It also said that that anybody who had been in rebellion against the United States may not serve unless Congress passes some sort of abolition of that restriction. And even though it was passed Congress in June of 1866, it would not be fully adopted until July of 1868, and actually would become part of the requirement, ratifying this amendment would become one of the requirements of rejoining the Union for Southern states. But that comes later. But Johnson, once again, did not want to enforce the Civil Rights Act. And so this was essentially trying to put it into the Constitution. Now, not until 1868 when it was fully ratified, would it become part of the Constitution. But remember, the Civil Rights Act had already passed despite his veto. So he had quite the overreaction, shall we say. He in 1866, as this was all boiling over, he tried to create his own party. Basically, yet another union party. Because the Democrats, being seen as kind of the party of the South, that they were in a fairly untenable position. In fact, Democrats would not have a particularly powerful position in the U.S. until basically the 1930s. From the 1860s all the way to the 1930s, it's often known as as an era of Republican control. There's a few exceptions where Congress was taken over by Democrats in 1872 and 78, and 1914 or 1912. And then there were two Democrat presidents between those, Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson, but they're kind of the exception to the norm. Republican power is through and through. And this is Johnson trying to kind of get around the stigma of being a Democrat. The problem with that being, he did this long speaking tour to kind of generate support called the Swing Around the Circle, and he started making statements that did not endear him to Congress. For instance, somebody yelled out during one of these speeches. Somebody yelled out, "Hang Jeff Davis," the president of the Confederacy, and he was in Cleveland at this point, and Johnson angrily replied, "Why don't you hang Thaddeus Stevens and Wendell Phillips, the two leading radical Republicans in Congress?" So he was actively campaigning to hang congressmen. And then, there's the Secretary of War issue. Edwin Stanton was quite a radical Republican himself, so he didn't want to leave, and he thought that that he would be replaced with somebody who would not be willing to enforce the military measures necessary to shore up the Freedmen's Bureau to keep civil rights and that kind of thing. But Johnson tried to fire him anyways over the whole Tenure of Office Act. And in fact, on February 21st, 1868, Stanton was fired but refused to leave his office. He actually barricaded the office. For 3 days, he stayed in there while Congress rushed to impeach Andrew Johnson, the first time a president had ever been impeached. And they took 2 days to pass the articles of impeachment, and Johnson stopped trying to fire the guy while the impeachment proceedings went along. Now, Johnson was not convicted because a conviction so impeachment is passed, as we've just recently seen. Impeachment is passed in the House and then sent to the Senate for conviction. And they pass very specific articles of impeachment, basically saying, he had violated the Tenure of Office Act, and therefore refused to execute the laws of the country, and refused to be president. But that's really specific, rather than the more general stuff of him obviously trying to stop Reconstruction from becoming more about civil rights rather than states coming back into the Union. And this did not pass, but it was literally only one vote away from conviction. So while he was still president, he'd basically been taught a lesson, and this is 1868. That's an election year. So while he would be forced to uphold the Congress's acts and everything, he was basically doomed to not win re-election, which is precisely what happened in 1868. General Grant ran for Ulysses S. Grant ran for president under the Republican Party and won. He's sometimes called the radical president, even though there's a lot of problems with the Grant administration, which we'll get to. So, how much time we got? About 20 minutes. So, Congress started passing its what were called military reconstruction acts that basically would use the military to enforce civil rights. The first of these actually passed in March of 1867, which was before the impeachment. But they would have a series of them and throughout the period. And then in 1868, Grant became president, so that now there's a Republican president who's actually willing to, well, he didn't become president until 1869. But, with a Republican president, they were actually willing to enforce these acts. But at the same time, there was the rise of the first Ku Klux Klan. Now, realize there are multiple Ku Klux Klans. The Ku Klux Klan of today is sometimes called the Fourth or Fifth Klan. And that one arose in the 1970s, and so is completely disconnected from this Klan, though obviously using the same kind of rhetoric. The Klan actually originally arose as a minstrel group. They would dress up in like blackface and that and have funny bits. And, that whole wearing masks stuff eventually turned towards using the masks to intimidate Black people, to stop them from voting in that. And especially since, now civil rights are being enforced, this is a bit of an issue. Because you have these Klansmen running around the South trying to stop Black people from voting, and Black people disproportionately voted Republican. They basically voted nothing but Republican at this point. The Klan was trying to stop that. They would also intimidate what were called carpetbaggers, as in Northerners who had come south. And they actually perpetrated a great deal of violence against white people as well, but specifically these kind of carpetbaggers and scalawags. Scalawags are people who voted Republican but were Southerner. They were seen as having been traitors to the South. Okay. Yeah, and it is quite interesting, Chase, that there's that the parties are quite the opposite. And Casey, if you're leaving, just be sure to finish up the class with the recording. Anyways, the obviously this challenged Republican dominance. The Klan was trying to stop Black people from voting, and Black people formed a significant base of Republicans in the South. In fact, the first black congressmen were Republicans, and that's all from this period. Wouldn't have a Democrat congressman that's black until I think the 1940s, if I remember correctly. So the and remember, we had already talked about how Republicans basically came to dominate politics from the 1860s all the way until the 1930s. So the South was trying to a lot of Southerners were trying to stop black people from voting by force, thereby maintaining white supremacy in the South. And so Congress also passed the 15th Amendment, also known as the Voting Rights Amendment. And essentially it said that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, essentially guaranteeing that black people can vote. We will talk about how that was later overturned, kind of, with Jim Crow and that, but Jim Crow comes decades later. So the 15th Amendment was passed in February of 1869 and ratified the following February in 1870, well into Grant's administration. Then in May of 1870, the Congress passed the Enforcement Act, also known as the Ku Klux Act, and it basically gave the military broad power to go after the Klan and make wide-ranging arrests. In fact, Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former Confederate general who was the leader of the Klan at the time, not the founder, by the way, people will say that he's the founder, but he was the leader at this point, claimed that that there were 550,000 members throughout the entire South, and that he was drawing up 40,000 people into an army to march on Washington. But that never arrived, and he officially disbanded the Klan right then and there, basically not willing to start another civil war. And by 1872, only a couple years after the passage of that act, the KKK had been fully disbanded. The KKK would not show up again until 1915. So from 1872 to 1915, the KKK did not exist, but there would be other groups, which we will get to. All right, there we go. Hopefully I can get edit these two videos back together. Unfortunately, that's what happens when you deal with Comcast. Comcast has decided that it doesn't want us to hold this meeting. So let us go back to screen sharing. I need to wait. No, wrong one. There we go. Need my notes. All right. Hopefully I can get through this in the next like 15 minutes. As you can see here with this map, the fight over trying to get the South back into the Union took time. So in black numbers, you can see when a state was readmitted into the Union. So you can see here, Tennessee was never actually under military government because they were readmitted during Johnson's administration. It is important to note that Johnson was actually from Tennessee. So, that's part of it. But you can see some of these states, it took until 1870 to rejoin. What that purple number is when when Republicans were defeated in local governments. So you can see once they were brought back into the Union, some of them took time to actually acquiesce to the Democrats. But all of them by the end of Reconstruction, 1877, would fall to the Democrats. Though there would be pockets of local control, there would actually be black congressmen basically all the way through to the New Deal, but they were few and far between. So as you can see, there's also divided into military districts. Those are each one of these military districts was commanded by a general, and then that general had basically full control over local laws. He could literally just say, this is the law now. But they tended to actually be fairly hands off, because there just wasn't that much Union military left. A lot of the Union military disbanded after the Civil War, and so you'd have a couple thousand troops to maintain these massive military districts. So it was really difficult to maintain any kind of control. So you kind of had to play this balancing game. But it would all fall apart eventually. And now we haven't really talked about Greater Reconstruction. I don't think we have time to talk about it now that Comcast decided to interrupt. But essentially, Greater Reconstruction is the idea that there's this, that Reconstruction applies to the North and the West too. For instance, Grant had the peace policy, and we will talk about that in a subsequent session. But Grant's peace policy, and always have to put that with scare quotes, that it was his Indian policy, and essentially he said like Indian land is reserved, and that any Indians going off of that reservation, reserved land, that's what reservation means, would be hunted down and treated as hostile. So for instance, there'd be a bunch of outbreaks of Apaches just near here under a guy named Geronimo, and they escaped down into Mexico, raid a bunch of stuff in Mexico, and then tried to come back. And so the U.S. had to deal with a bunch of that kind of stuff. So obviously the peace policy wasn't so peaceful. And there's a lot more problems with it, but we can't get into that now. There were other things with Greater Reconstruction. For instance, in 1868, there was the passage of the Anti-Peonage Act, which specifically targeted New Mexico, because peonage was not, which basically said that if you have debt, that you had to work your debts off, and that debt peonage ended up ballooning as people couldn't really work themselves out of it, and so they were held in a virtual state of bondage while neither being slaves, which requires like ownership. You can't like, it's not slavery if it isn't involving property. And it wasn't quite indentured servitude either, because that has a set time. So Congress had to specifically make a law against peonage, which was pretty pervasive throughout all of New Mexico. It also targeted stuff in Utah and California. So yeah, there was this Greater Reconstruction everywhere else. Then, throughout this period, to keep Reconstruction going, the Republicans especially wanted to pass further and further civil rights acts to enforce the civil rights, to enforce the Reconstruction amendments through more and more funding and enforcement and measures to keep civil rights. And in order to do so, they would keep on bringing up the deaths of the Civil War. And this was called waving the bloody shirt because it was seen as kind of disingenuous that you can only bring up the Union dead so many times. And by continuously playing this game of, look at how many people died for this cause, we need to do more. And it started forming a split, and Republicans, for instance, Horace Greeley became the leader of one of these Republican groups that kind of grew tired of the radicalism. Also, the bloody shirt is also a very clear reference to the red flag of communism, but not more socialism and leftism and that kind of thing, because there was actually quite a bit of talk between that. And for instance, Horace Greeley himself had employed Karl Marx for a while. So Karl Marx had written for Horace Greeley for throughout the 1850s. And yet Greeley was thinking that that the Republicans had become too radical when he had literally employed Karl Marx. And so they formed the Liberal Republican Party to try to challenge Ulysses S. Grant in 1872. It was kind of a farce. Nobody took him seriously. Greeley would actually become so incensed that he would eventually join the Democrats, but he died anyways, so it didn't matter. So there was also the white supremacist reaction to all of this radicalism. Civil rights was considered radical. And so white supremacists were not just in the South, they were very much in the North as well. And so there were groups that came out and to replace the Ku Klux Klan. For instance, there was the White League and the Red Shirts. And these were much more covert. They knew not to be so overt as to be riding around with, pointy hats and whatnot. They would form clubs called like the Mounted Baseball Club. And if you've ever played baseball, you know that riding a horse doesn't have anything to do with it. So that's the kind of thing that they would be doing to continue this kind of violent intimidation. And then there were, and as part of that arose the Democrats, a wing of the Democrat Party called the Southern Redeemers, and they wanted to redeem the South to its white supremacist origins. And so as this kind of paramilitary arm of like the White League attacked Black people and stopped them from voting, Southern Redeemers would enact laws now that they were in power to disenfranchise Black people, leading to Jim Crow. But it wasn't there yet by the end of Reconstruction. They also used this idea of what's called the lost cause. We've already talked a little bit about it, but it's actually a much more pervasive myth that it's the idea that like slavery was good for the slaves, that it was like bringing them up to civilization, that the Civil War itself was not about slavery, that it was, truly about Southern independence, and that, that it was a war of Northern aggression. They used this rhetoric in order to redeem the South, that Reconstruction was really just to punish the South. It had nothing to do with civil rights. Despite the fact that it was absolutely about civil rights. So they use this rhetoric to kind of come back to power. And what really hurt the Republicans from fighting this was the Long Depression, which began in 1873 and lasted all the way until 1879. This was a depression. So economic instability is a sure indicator of the incumbent party losing power, We just saw it with this election, for instance. There's economic instability. Look how the incumbent party lost power. Same thing happened in 2016. There was an economic downturn in 2016, and therefore the Republicans came into power. That same thing happened, just not with the presidents, because but the Democrats did manage to take Congress in the 1870s. And then, of course, the Grant administration itself, the radical president, managed to make himself a bit of a fool by having a bunch of scandals, one after the other, just all kinds of craziness. And we'll get into that during the Gilded Age lecture. But the he had several scandals that just embroiled his administration in newspaper just scandal after scandal. That all being said, then came the election of 1876. The Republican candidate was Hayes and the Democrat candidate was Tilden. And the election was so close that it actually got thrown into Congress. The Congress had to figure it out themselves. They did. It was too close to call, and the election commission had some sort of backroom bargain. There's actually no record of this bargain being struck or anything along those lines, but it's often called the corrupt bargain. And essentially, the bargain was that Hayes would become president so long as he would remove military Reconstruction from the South, but thereby guaranteeing that the South could remain solid. You notice on that map, that map shows a number of them flipping in 1877. That's because civil rights could no longer be enforced by the military because of the passage of the Posse Comitatus Act, basically making it so that that the military could not be used as a posse. And so, well, there's specific exceptions. For instance, the Insurrection Act is being used right now in Washington. But the besides those exceptions, it meant that enforcing civil rights was not possible with the military, and therefore federal enforcement could not happen. And so the South ultimately won the Reconstruction. This set the way for Jim Crow, which we will have an entire lecture on. That by the 1890s, the Democrats had managed to gain enough power that they could fully disenfranchise the black vote and guarantee a steady power base in the South for decades to come. So while the Civil War is kind of a triumph of defeating slavery and that kind of stuff, the aftermath, the Reconstruction, was ultimately an unfinished revolution. How much time do we have? We have gone over time. Okay. Well, sorry we've gone over time. Before we stop, are there any questions? No? All right. Well, then I will see you guys on Tuesday, 12:30, and the link will be the same, so you can just go and find it on Learn. And I will, once I have to combine these videos now, once that's done, it will be uploaded. So if you missed anything, you can go back and see the recording. I will see you guys on Tuesday.